there's a reason why we have relied on the criminal justice system for so long to handle substance use. It is because we have positioned it for so long as this moral crisis in a person's life that needs such severe discipline that we have said the criminal justice system is the right tool to get them back on track.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me on the Gift of Need podcast. I'm Jude Trang. I'm host, an author, and an observer of human need in society. And this podcast seeks to address the overlooked power of human need and how it affects our relationships, our communities, and society as a whole. And I hope to just whet your appetite, okay, to get you starting to think about how our needs are not burdens, but can be gifts and opportunities. And I do that with an intriguing guest like I have on today. Christina Dent is the author of Curious, a foster mom's discovery of an unexpected solution to drugs and addiction. And she's with me today, and we're going to be talking about addiction recovery and why we need to rethink the reasons behind addiction and the traditional solutions. So, hi, Christina.
Hi, Jude. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor, joy to be here.
Oh, thank you. So, today we're going to be discussing addiction and some of the reasons that individuals become addicted and how we need to reconsider the circumstances that face the people that are struggling with addiction. And curiosity led Christina to write Curious. And I'm going to read this. Curious tells her story along with the people and research that cross her path, giving her a vision for unexpected solutions that save lives, heal families, and promote public safety. But Curious isn't just a story. It's an invitation to readers to get curious along with Christina and consider for themselves whether the shift that she comes to believe in could be the best way to reduce harms from drugs so all of us have a better opportunity to thrive. So, Christina, would you tell us a little bit about your background and what first led you, a conservative Southern mom, into the world of drug addiction and recovery?
Yeah. So I'm a born and raised Mississippian. I have lived in Mississippi my whole life. I grew up in a wonderful conservative Christian family, had a very happy childhood. That was the community and culture that I was surrounded by. And certainly there are critiques of that culture that are fair, but for me, it was a pretty positive experience. I had a lot of wonderful people that invested in my life. And what that culture taught in the 80s and 90s was a lot of make the right decisions, make the right choices, and that's what I was good at. I could do that. I knew how to succeed and excel in that culture. And so it kind of, quote unquote, worked for me. I'm already kind of geared in that direction anyway. I like to accomplish things. I like to perform well. And so it kind of was like, oh, this works. This is good. I know how to do this. And so I didn't really have to grapple with just the complexities of life and the struggles that people have. It wasn't that my life was free from struggles, but they were struggles that I saw as not my own choice. My parents both got cancer and passed away. I was in a train wreck. I tell all those stories in the book. And Curious, those were not my choice. And so I realize now, looking back, what I was developing was a keen sensitivity towards suffering that was not self-induced, but a quick ability to be able to turn off that compassion and empathy as soon as it seemed like it was someone's choice that was the reason things were not going well in their life. I didn't recognize that at the time. I thought of myself as a pretty compassionate, empathetic person, but I can look back and easily see how I was towards certain people, not towards other people. And the kind of defining feature of what made the difference was, did I feel like it was their fault? Did I feel like whatever it was going through was their fault?
Mm.
Um, and so I became a foster parent in my early 30s, and that helped me to begin to rethink how I had always approached the world in very black and white terms, good people, bad people, right and wrong, and everything is very clear. And I began to see through the lives of real people struggling with addictions that it was not very clear. And there were lots of things that I didn't know and lots of experiences people were grappling with that I had never had. And I didn't have to figure out how to cope with the kinds of suffering and experiences some other people had. And that was really the beginning of a learning journey for me that changed my heart, changed my mind, changed my career, really changed everything for me.
Hmm. So, as a foster mom, you came to understand personally some of the mothers who were addicted to drugs and that whole, their children being taken away. So, tell us about your initial responses to what you began to discover. Was there like fear, and did it cause you to kind of want to run the other direction, or how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I didn't have any context for how to understand substance use. Um, Certainly not substance use during pregnancy. And that was not part of our training as foster parents in terms of understanding, what causes addiction, what are people really struggling with. So I just took what I had learned in my upbringing, which was very much so of addiction as a character deficiency, of a kind of moral failing. You've lost your moral compass. You don't care anymore about hurting other people or hurting yourself. And so, and that very much is where I also got the idea that the solution to that is punishment. Because if we have character problems, if we have people behaving badly, they need to be disciplined to get back on the right track. And so there's a reason why we have relied on the criminal justice system for so long to handle substance use. It is because we have positioned it for so long as this moral crisis in a person's life that needs such severe discipline that
Mm.
we have said the criminal justice system is the right tool to get them back on track. But what I saw in the people that I met and the mothers that I met along the way of our fostering journey was people just like me, moms just like me, who loved their children, wanted to be there for them, were also struggling with a really complex health crisis. And that was a real wake up call for me because it was very different from what I had kind of grown up um, thinking and believing. And it was really difficult to confront that because anytime we're confronted with something that is different from what we currently believe, we tend to be pretty good at just saying, well, it's wrong, or, well, I just don't believe that. Or we just move past it. We get that cognitive dissonance. Humans don't like to live in that space. We figure out a way to make it all feel better. And that's what I wanted to do. But I'm thankful that, particularly Joanne, one of the moms who I got to know the best on that journey, just helped me to see who she really was. She helped me to see how much she loved her son. She helped me to see how much she wanted to be um, sober, and helped me to see how complex and how difficult it is for people who are struggling to find a path to sobriety because the reasons that they have ended up in a place of substance misuse are incredibly complex.
Yeah.
They are not solved overnight, and oftentimes, even if you have a clear understanding of why something has happened, it's hard enough to kind of take the steps and figure out what you need to do to move past that. For a lot of people, they don't understand why they're doing the things that they're doing. That I've talked to many people struggle with addiction. They're like, I don't know. It just feels like I just went crazy, or it just feels like I, I, I don't know what I'm trying to numb. I just know I feel better when I'm using a substance.
Right.
And I think, if we can kind of expand our thought processes a little bit, we can all understand that. Why do we do the things that we do? We all have unhealthy coping mechanisms that we go to. Why do we eat the second, third, and fourth piece of cake? Why are we unable to stop scrolling? Why do we go out and spend a bunch of money on new clothes when we don't need them and we don't have the money for them? These things are doing something for us. And we don't always know exactly what that is. We just know I feel better. I get some kind of relief when I engage in this activity. And that was kind of where I began to see, wait a second, addictions of all kinds are a coping mechanism for something going on in our lives that is uncomfortable. And this repeated behavior is a way of self-medicating that.
Yeah. Well, and I want to touch a little bit more on fear because I think even in our whole society right now, there's a lot of fear related to a lot of things, and there are people promulgating that fear. I find that it does impact individuals and spreads into communities. And yes, we all have our inherent fight or flight, response for real dangers. The question is this a real or fabricated danger? And I wonder sometimes about that. What is the fear? Is it that we're going to just let these people loose and then everybody's kids are going to be addicted, or if we don't punish them or lock them away? And, a lot of leaders, faith community leaders, politicians use fear to motivate people because fear is a very powerful emotion and it can produce short-term results, right, and compliance. But it also shuts down, your rational thinking. A lot of times it destroys trust. And then it fosters this like blame. And like you said, well, they made a choice or whatever. So you moved past those fears. But how did you do that? Was it by actually looking past the traditional thinking and getting to know people, the relationship thing?
Yeah, it was, and it was having safe places to explore new ideas. That's a really important part, and something that End It for Good, the nonprofit that I founded, is deeply committed to, is providing these safe places and events that we speak at, events that we host, anytime that we are inviting people to consider something that might feel uncomfortable, might be different than what they've heard before. We want them to have a space to do that is as safe as possible, because the only way that you can learn is if you don't feel afraid. If you feel afraid, your mind is in fight, flight, freeze. You can't learn when you're afraid. Your brain is doing other things and it has shut
Right.
down its learning centers. Um, and so, we want people to pause that fear. I have a friend who lost his son to an overdose a number of years ago, and he says when he invites people to consider the ideas that End It for Good is now talking about, he believes in those as well in terms of health-centered solutions. He says, I tell people, take all that fear that you feel and put it on a shelf for a little while. Come and think about these ideas with me. If you want to take that fear back off the shelf and go back to the same way that you had felt before, you can do that. But just try for a little while to set the fear aside and to really just engage with, why is all of this harm happening? Why are so many people dying? Why is there so much crime related to drugs? Why do we have, cartels and terrorist organizations that are making so much money from drugs? Why do we have so many people incarcerated for drugs? And are these things solving problems? Are our current solutions solving those problems, or are they making those problems worse? We want people to have their brains online. Like, we try to reduce the amount of fear that people feel, because our belief is that we largely have the approach we have today because we haven't been thinking about it, because we've just been afraid. And when you're afraid, you try to just control, you try to just stamp something out, you try to put it in a box, put the top on it, and just force things to happen. And that has largely been our approach to substance use in the United States for the last 100 years, has been, we're going to solve this problem through force. We're going to force people not to use. We're going to discipline them when they do. And we're going to just keep pounding, 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 and we will win this. And for me, learning, for other people learning, for us as we find better solutions. It's super important that we're able to put some of that fear aside. There is very real justified fear related to substance use in terms of, substances can be incredibly detrimental in your life. They can destroy your life. They can lead to overdose. The primary means they do that is through contamination from underground markets. But there is very real risk to substance use. We don't want to gloss over that. We don't want to celebrate drug use. And I think for people, as they engage with our work, one of the big things they're looking for is, wait a second, if they're asking us to kind of consider a different approach, is it because they are okay with everyone just being out there celebrating, using drugs? Let's all do whatever we want to, and who cares? And we say, no, there's a third way. It doesn't have to be that we criminalize, crack down, and keep playing whack-a-mole. And it also doesn't have to be that we swing the pendulum the whole other direction and say, it doesn't matter. Everybody do whatever you want to. Let's just, put drugs in the candy aisle. Those are false options. There are other options that we have taken with something like tobacco, where we have educated against its harms, significantly reducing tobacco use, but we don't arrest people for smoking. We allow them to make that choice. There are ways we've already kind of taken this approach of very real risk, but approaching that in a way that actually reduces harm rather than just increasing it.
Well, and it hasn't worked. The punitive criminal justice system hasn't worked, which we'll talk more about later. So as you searched for answers and you continued, what did you find out that happens to people, men and women, when their addiction brings them in contact with a violent underground criminal market for drugs and eventually the criminal justice system? Because due to the illegal nature of drugs and the behavior to help them find their drugs, then a lot of people end up in the criminal justice system. So this cycle of harm that, and suffering that addicted families experience, explain to us what it says.
Yeah. So as I was learning, I got interested because I was curious about addiction. What drives addiction? What have we misunderstood about addiction? And as I started learning about that, I began realizing, wow, there's all these other aspects of drugs and drug markets and all of the other things that I hadn't even considered before. I had never learned about this. And so I ended up kind of distilling this into what I call kind of the three harms. And there's more, but kind of three primary, thinking about when a drug is pushed into the underground market. So when we ban it, which is what we typically do to anything new that comes out, we say, hey, this could potentially be harmful. Let's just ban it, and that will make it go away. But it doesn't make it go away. It just pushes it onto the underground market because consumers still want to buy these drugs. And anytime you have consumer demand, somebody is going to supply those drugs. That's true in prisons today. People can get drugs very easily in prison. They will often say they can get them more easily in prison than they can get them out in the free world. So if we can't keep drugs out of prison because there's demand for drugs, and there's always going to be somebody who's willing to take the risk to supply those drugs, we haven't been able to keep drugs out of prisons, and yet we're still on this path trying to figure out how to keep them out of the rest of the free world. And what that does is pushes these into underground markets, which can only be operated by people breaking the law. There's no law and order in an underground market. You can't take a dispute to the courts. You're engaging in illegal activity. What are you going to do? You're going to take care of it yourself on the streets. So we have massive amounts of crime and violence that are caused by the underground drug market. And we tend to think of it as drugs is the problem. And End It for Good would say, consider that it's actually drug prohibition that is causing this. It isn't the drugs that are causing the violence. It is this underground market that is fighting over routes and street corners and drug deals gone bad and who ripped off who. And that is where so much of it comes from, because there's so much money to be made by selling drugs. I mean, the
Yep.
underground drug market, globally is, I think it's about $500 billion a year. You get this huge pile of money. People are going to fight over that. They want $500 billion a year. So you have more crime from prohibited drugs. You also have contamination. There's no quality control on an underground market. People put fentanyl in the drugs. There's no way for consumers to know what they're taking. So you end up with an overdose crisis. That is exactly what we have been living through. People using drugs. The vast majority of people who die from overdose or their death is from unregulated drugs that they bought on the street and they didn't know what was in it to dose it appropriately. So we have this harm of crime, we have this harm of death from preventable overdose, from contamination, and then we have the harm that comes from consumers being criminalized for drug possession. And I think it's important to distinguish between other crimes people might commit related to their substance use and the crime of drug possession. So we would say we don't think drug possession should be a crime. It just doesn't help someone address their substance use, and it introduces lots of challenges, some of them lifelong, into a person's life. But we still can hold people accountable for their behavior that affects the rest of the community. We can enforce laws against public drug use. We can enforce laws against driving under the influence, just like we do with alcohol.
Right.
We can enforce laws against theft. And maybe that theft is as a result of I need more money to support my addiction. And that could be a great opportunity for a drug court to say, hey, you have committed theft against another person. In order to execute justice for that person and what they've lost, you need to be held accountable. But we also recognize that just putting you in jail for a couple of months isn't going to do anything to help that problem. And if you don't address the addiction, you'll just be back out and probably committing theft again. So instead, maybe that's where a drug court can come in. I know people have lots of different opinions about drug courts. Some of them are run well, some of them are run horribly. But I do think they are a tool that can be helpful, particularly in cases where someone has broken another law, but really the underlying issue is their addiction.
Well, and this incarceration in America has skyrocketed since the 1970s, mainly related to drug-related crimes, right? We have the highest rate of incarceration in the developed world and one of the highest rates in the world, period. We lock up 760 people per 100,000 of our citizens, $80 billion annually. So, when you think of drug court as an option, as a way to keep those people out of the criminal justice system, so and the prison population is predominantly Black, and they are incarcerated for drug offenses 10 times that of whites. So what has this done to families of all skin colors, and what impact, is it continuing to have long term, especially on the innocent victims, the children?
Yeah. I don't think many of us think about people in prison as being connected to families. Growing up, I never thought about that. This just reminds me of, I tell a story in the book, but I rarely talk about this in interviews. But when I was growing up at our church, there was a woman, an older woman who was she worked at the prison. She would go and lead a Bible study at the prison. And I grew up in a small evangelical church, that we weren't doing prison ministry other than, what she was doing. And everybody I knew was kind of, my assumption was, from what I heard, everybody was kind of a tough on crime conservative. And she would get us kids to help her make these cards. And she would take them to the prison so that the women there could send the cards to their kids at Christmas time or at different holidays. And I just remember thinking, wait, what? It has never crossed my mind that people in prison would have children and that they would have children they're in contact with. and that they would want to send cards to. Like in my mind, people in prison were these hardened, terrible people that didn't care about anybody but themselves. And it was just, it didn't make any sense to me. Like this sounds like kind of a regular mom who wants to do something nice at Christmas for her child. And I think a lot of us struggle to make that connection because whatever the news picks up is going to be the worst of the worst. They're not telling us about just random people who get picked up for drug possession and they're sitting in the county jail. That's just not newsworthy. It happens all the time, every single day. So what that does, though, to families, we know that children who have a parent that's incarcerated are more likely to experience a whole host of negative social outcomes in their life. They're more likely to one day be incarcerated themselves. They're more likely to struggle with substance use, not because they're bad kids, but because when you grow up in a home that is fractured, it is much more likely that you're going to struggle to not have that fracturing continue to affect your life as you grow up.
And that fracturing is trauma. That's the
Yeah.
point. That is trauma, like sexual abuse, like physical abuse, like being so poor you cannot get your meals, you know.
Yeah.
This is a trauma that you can't and being in the foster system. There are some wonderful foster parents like you. There are others who I know whose stories are just horrific of the
Yeah.
people. They'll take 8 foster kids, lock them in closets in the day, not feed them, abuse them because they get money for it. So, you know, in Curious, you propose instead of that, that you propose empathy, connection, and treating addiction as a health issue, and it's more effective. Do you have any statistics to back this up?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the research on what creates risk for addiction is very robust. We know that trauma is one of the biggest drivers of risk factors for addiction. Um, but so we're kind of stuck in this middle ground, Jude. This is what I feel like. So we have all this research. We have ACEs studies that have looked at adverse childhood experiences and what they put people at risk for. It doesn't mean everyone who has a difficult childhood will become addicted, but just that's a significant risk factor if you have been through difficult experiences. Even if they were a one-time experience, it didn't have to be that you had an ongoing terrible experience.
Right.
Just going through really tough things. A parent's divorce, for example, that's a very common experience for children to walk through, but that is also has very significant lifelong impacts on a lot of kids. So we know what creates these risk factors for addiction. Some of it can be genetic from your family history. Some of it is experiential. There's so many different components to what creates risk factors for addiction. We know that. But we're kind of stuck in this middle ground where for so long we have handled it as a character flaw. We now have all of this research saying, wow, this is not bad people doing bad things because they want to be bad. This is suffering and hurting people who are trying to feel better, even for a little while with a substance. And so we have to look at what does the data say on this approach of incarceration? Like, does it work? And Pew Research or Pew Trust did research a couple of years ago, and they took all of the states that had the harshest drug laws, kind of toughest approach, sentencing, arresting, that sort of thing. And they looked at outcomes related to substance use. Did that result in fewer people using drugs, dying of overdose? Like, did it actually reduce the drug-related harms that it's supposed to? And they found no relationship. So states that had very permissive drug laws didn't have more drug use and more overdoses, and states that had very restrictive drug laws, and they didn't have better outcomes. So they found really how your state approaches substance use in the criminal justice system has no impact on what people actually do and what the outcomes are. This is not, again, it makes sense because this is not an issue of bad people who just need to, be slapped on the wrist. This is an issue of suffering people. You can't solve suffering by sticking someone in jail. You can't solve uh, mental health issues by putting someone in jail. So,
Exactly.
the more that we can begin to say, you know what, we have better research now. We know what creates risk. We also know far better how to help people actually overcome addiction and find a path to recovery. Um, and so we have kind of two opposing trajectories that are happening at the same time. We're still arresting people. At the same time, we're also saying people need help to overcome the difficulties in their life.
Right.
And we're kind of
Okay.
stuck in the middle. We need to let go of the one.
That's right. So I want to ask you then, what are the most difficult areas of resistance then to rethinking our approach from criminal justice and smack you on the hand to all aspects of addiction? Are faith communities more skeptical than society at large because of a tendency to, view things in a black and white moral issue?
Yeah, I think my experience, so I live in Mississippi, I'm in the deep South and the buckle of the Bible Belt. And my experience is that, especially in the faith community, it is difficult to make that shift. I think it has more to do with, um, so that there definitely is a leaning towards kind of this more black and white thinking, more kind of, justice means you are held accountable when you make poor decisions. But I think the stronger cultural part of that for people of faith in the U.S. is that for many, many years, in part due to the influence of organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, addiction has been framed not just as a moral issue, but as a spiritual issue. Um, for some people, it is framed entirely that way. So they would say the only way for you to overcome your addiction is for you to have a conversion experience, to give your life to Jesus. And if that's what you're coming from, it's really difficult to consider, wait, someone might need medication. They might, they might need to be on Suboxone. They might need to be on methadone for an opioid addiction. That is really difficult to kind of make sense of that if your understanding of addiction it is that it is primarily or solely a spiritual issue. So I'm a believer. I'm a Christian. Um, I I want people to have that experience of faith. I believe it's super important, but I also believe that it is not necessary for someone to find sobriety. They can find sobriety in many different ways, just like they can find healing from many other challenges that they are facing, whether it's mental health challenges, whether it's social or career challenges. I think it's unhelpful to both sobriety and to faith to say they have to go together. And if they aren't married together, then it's not real. I think, look, there's people who are atheists that find sobriety every day. There's people who are believers who struggle with addiction for the rest of their lives. This is not a transaction where faith equals sobriety and no faith equals addiction. That is just not, it's not the real world. It is not, I would say it is not what the Bible teaches. I don't think there's other religious texts that teach that either. Um, and so I think that's the bigger challenge is really grappling with how much our psyche in the United States has been saturated in the idea that addiction is a moral issue and a spiritual issue that can only be solved through spiritual means.
Yeah, yeah. Well, would you share a story from one of the families that you've walked alongside of who have experienced a hopeful path to a better outcome?
Yeah, so I'll share one that's going to challenge people a little bit because I want to give them things to think about after after they finish listening to this. This is one that just happened recently. So we had Recovery Day at the Capitol here in Mississippi. I would encourage anyone. You can do a Recovery Day in any state that you live in. It's easy to do, and it gives people a way to just show their support for recovery. So we hosted a recovery day at the Mississippi State Capitol. And one of the we kind of gave an invitation for people who wanted to share their stories as part of the press conference that we had. And I think we had about 10 or 11 people who did. And one of them is a woman named Kelsey Parker. And she had struggled with addiction, started using substances when she was an early teenager, very difficult experiences in her life, started using, began struggling with a substance use disorder, and continued for 17 years. And she tried many times to stop using, just could not do it. Always the flashbacks would come back from the abuse that she had suffered. And so she would go back to using again. So Mississippi passed a medical marijuana program. The dispensaries for that opened 3 years ago. And she went and got a medical marijuana card. Now, addiction is not a qualifying condition in Mississippi for our program, but she had also been diagnosed with another disorder that did qualify her to get a medical marijuana card. So she got it, and she started out using a pretty high amount of medical marijuana, trying to stop using the methamphetamine that she had been using previously. And she was able to. She was able to stop using the meth. And over time, she was able to radically reduce her dose, the amount of medical marijuana that she was using, and how she was taking it. You know, she went from smoking it to now taking it as, I think she takes it as a gummy now. But just a small amount in the morning and the evening. And she was able to rebuild her life. She works now. She's rebuilding relationships with her kids. She's married. She's been doing great for the last couple of years since she was able to do this. So there's a lot of people who would say she's not sober. She's still using something. She's not completely abstinent. And I would encourage them to consider, what is the goal of sobriety? Is the goal of sobriety that somebody doesn't have something in their cabinet? Or is the goal of sobriety that somebody has a healthy, thriving life, and they're connected, they're able to work if they have the capacity to do that, they're able to have relationships with their family, they're able to be part of the community, their health is improved. Isn't that what we want for people?
Yes.
And I think we've lost sight of that. We've focused on the method and said only a certain method is valid. And we've lost sight of the goal. Why do we care in the first place? Because we want people to be alive and healthy and connected to their families and community and doing well.
That's right.
And Kelsey is doing well.
That's what we use medications for. That's why we have diabetics on medicine, and cancer patients on cancer, and heart disease patients on heart disease. You know, they're poisons if you take them wrong.
Yep.
But they bring health when taken correctly, right?
Yeah.
Well, Christina, you've now given a TEDx talk and founded a thriving nonprofit called End It for Good, inviting people to consider, these seismic shifts slowly. You're very gentle about it, and about looking at how cultures worldwide approach drugs. So as we end, do you feel hopeful that real change is possible here, and that you've starting to see some tangible results like this story?
Yes, I feel very hopeful, because cultural change takes a long time. Policy change takes even longer. But a change in an individual family can happen at any time. And so for me, that's a huge win. If there's a parent listening to this that maybe they've got a child who says, hey, I want to try medication, and the parent has said, no, that's not valid. You can't be on medication. I'm not going to go get you on a Suboxone program. That's not real recovery. Maybe after listening to this, they say, you know what? Let's try it. Yeah, like the goal is for you to be healthy and alive, and I'm willing to support whatever path might get you there. Wow, what a huge win. That could be life-changing for a family. And that we can't get stuck on how long it takes to change policy. Families and individuals can change at any time, and that is how big changes are going to happen anyway, by individuals changing their minds, changing the way they interact with the people that they love and the people they love who are struggling with substance use disorder, and beginning to make those cultural changes where we can see those policy changes come. So I feel super hopeful about that.
Well, there's so much more to cover on this topic. So what we're going to have a second podcast next week as we reconsider better paths to addiction recovery that Christina and the End It for Good organization are talking about. We're going to get down to the specifics. So thank you, Christina, for making the time to be with us today and to talk about how the needs we all have, like your need to thoroughly satisfy your curiosity and not just accept the pat answers that you knew and had heard and had been taught about addiction and the people who struggled with addiction. And these can become then opportunities and gifts, and then thereby other people, the needs of individuals and communities and societies are all benefited, and it brings joy and fulfillment to us all. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jude. It's a joy to be here.
Yeah. All right, folks, I highly recommend Curious. It's insightful, emotional, and a necessary read for anyone dealing with family, friends, or even community with struggling with addiction, which in America today is pretty much all of us. And you can check out Christina's work and order her book by going to enditforgood. Is it com or org?
Yep. .com.
And tune in to her End It for Good podcast, where discussions with experts from all different areas and of addiction and medicine and psychology discuss this with Christina in detail. So the great music you are hearing was written and performed by Gabe Kubanda at Kubanda Music. You can find him on any streaming service. The engineer is Ray Engineering of 3rd Street Productions here in Tucson, Arizona. Please consider following, rating, and subscribing to my free Substack newsletter and the podcast, and leave a comment or review. I'd love to hear from you. Bye.